Sorry, no. I know this is you. Warwick. It's you.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for making the effort to come in this horrible, rainy, torrential evening. I can see some of my students as well, so kudos to you guys. It is an indication of the quality of the speaker and the massive success of his most recent book, and the book he's also going to be talking about this evening. It gives us great pleasure to welcome Tim Marshall, who's the former diplomatic correspondent with Sky News, who I think has been in so many war zones I cannot count. Incredibly, I think, Tim, your bio says you worked for Sky for almost 24 years, so it must have been there right from the start. Also, many of us will know Tim's Orwell Prize-listed blog, Foreign Matters. He was listed for the Orwell Prize in 2010. He will be speaking tonight on his most recent book, which is on the power and politics of flags. No question mark on that, but we didn't want to miss the opportunity to also have him speak on a book that many of us know, I know my students very much appreciate as well, which is Prisoners of Geography, which was a Sunday Times and New York Times bestseller. So Tim is not only very kind to come and join us this evening, he's doubly so because he could be on a yacht somewhere, I imagine, enjoying his life. And Tim will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes on the subject of his two books, and he will be, there will be a response by Dr. Jamie Gascorth, who we're also delighted to welcome from the University of Birmingham this evening. Jamie is one of the few people in UK universities, incredibly, I hope this is not a sign of the future, who writes seriously and academically about British foreign policy. We tend to have a lot of courses in UK universities that discuss Chinese foreign policy or American foreign policy or international relations more broadly. And Jamie's going to respond for 5 to 10 minutes and bring the conversation back to the focus on the British national interest, which very much actuates everything we do here at Policy Exchange as part of our process. And then we'll hopefully have time to open it up for you, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm going to vacate the stage in favor of the slides and hand over to Tim. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Certainly thank you to Policy Exchange for the invitation. It is a great honour to be here. I am aware that I stand before you a generalist in front of experts. Yes, many of you. And an amateur in front of professionals, because I am a generalist. I'm not an expert. James, for example, comes from academia, and I come at things from a very different angle, as will become obvious. Any vexillologists in the room, please leave now. Anyone who doesn't suffer fools gladly? Likewise. I wrote that because I was aware from when I was a young reporter that this was the missing element in understanding current affairs. And the one thing that did it for me was standing, looking at a valley. There was a village on fire. It was in Bosnia. And I remember that journalists at this point usually say mindless violence. And I asked the guy, well, why did you burn that village? He said, well, if you burn that village, everybody runs away to that village, and they know what happened, and then they all run away, and then they all disappear out of the valley, and we need that valley because it connects to the motorway. So it's not mindless at all. It's brutally, coldly logic. I always try to inject that sense of geography into my reporting. I don't argue it's the determining factor of history. I regard it as a determining factor in history. And it is the overlooked one, but it seems to be coming back into fashion, geopolitics. People like the Mackinder theory of the heartland from 100 years ago. And it went out of fashion for a long time because it is a bit deterministic, which is a rather cold view of the world. But I am feeling a bit, when you were younger, or perhaps students now, you know when you like a band and no one else likes them and you're really cool, and then suddenly they become famous and everyone likes the band, but I like them first. Well, that's a bit how I feel about geopolitics, because it went so out of fashion for a couple of years. And it is now back. I really believe it's back front and centre, and that's because we're back in the age of identity politics. And I followed it up for the same reasons that I don't think people take enough notice of symbols either and what they mean to people. And we know the whole debate about Little Englanders and Brexit. And it was because people don't understand the power of the symbols and that they still have a connection with people. I was at UCL recently, and a young guy said to me, "You don't understand that the nation flags are just so out of date, nobody cares about them anymore." Okay. He said, "Well, you know, sometimes the flags of the great corporations like Nike or McDonald's mean more to us." Okay. So if somebody attacks a McDonald's and burns that flag, are you going to leap out of a trench, fix your bayonet, and say, "For Ronald"? No, you're not. He didn't concede the point, but he is missing the point that to a great many people, the nation-state flags and the symbols mean a great deal. Again, I did an interview for a very beautiful organisation. Sorry, I said like Trump then. Beautiful organisation. Beautiful. Beautiful. Called Little Atoms. Very, very. And again, I was asked, don't you really think that actually we've got over flags, that most people are very embarrassed in Britain by their nation-state flag? And I said, no, you mean those people that you talk to and socialise with are, but everybody else isn't. And this is something that I don't think people have quite got hold of yet. They still haven't moved outside of the bubble we've heard so much about. Right, that's the introduction. On to geography, which I was terrible at school. I got the dates of the battles wrong every time. But we'll start on that one. Thank you, those that caught up, and those of you who didn't think it was funny but laughed anyway. Right, here's the map of the world that we know and love. We grew up on it. I just wanted to put it up for perspective, because, for example, look at Greenland and look at Africa. That's the Mercator map. And then we move, sorry, we're supposed to have moved on, but I didn't put the slide into the Peters map. And the Peters map shows you a different perspective of the world, about how long Africa is, how small Greenland is. And it's always useful to look at things in different perspectives, and also to get a geographic perspective. They say the Earth has shrunk, but it's still a very large place, and it's still a very, very diverse place. The way to begin to understand how geography is a determining factor in history and plays its part in nationalism and therefore the politics of the place is Russia. It keeps getting invaded, usually from that direction there, sometimes up there. Either way, it gets invaded through its flatland there. It used to get invaded by the Mongolians, but they plugged that gap there. So the Urals is a barrier, the Arctic is a barrier, they plugged that. They've got the Black Sea. This has been this difficult period, part of the country. The North European plain stretches from France to the Urals, and it's flat. Fantastic for tanks, cavalry, Napoleon, Hitler, you name it. It's a good place if you want to invade Russia. And the narrowest point of the North European flat plain is from the Baltic Sea there to the Carpathian Mountains there. It's only 300 miles wide. So if you're Russia, and between 1812 and 1941, you've been fighting in this flat ground here, once every 35, 36, 37 years, imagine what that does to your head. If you're Russian, every 35 years, you know, we're going to be fighting there. What are you going to do? You don't have a choice. You will move forward and you will dominate that land, even if it is called Poland. I've got the Times Atlas of the last 2,000 years. When you flick through it really quickly, it's like those things that you had when you were a kid, the cartoons that move. And Poland moves and changes shapes and disappears and comes back. And it's because of where it is, the narrowest point in the North European plain. So of course, Putin and everybody else has sought to plug the gap, and part of that jigsaw are those three countries there. It's also why it's an existential matter for them to have a warm water port. You can't be a 365-day navy without a warm water port to get you to the sea lanes, and yet these ports freeze. Even Murmansk freezes sometimes. So you can't get out into the sea lanes. You can't really get out from the Black Sea, but the one warm water port you've got is in Crimea. So if Ukraine flips into the Western sphere of influence, existential matter for the Russians, no choice if you leave decency and a Westphalian notion of history. If you leave those niceties out, he had no choice. He was a prisoner of geography. He had to take part of Ukraine, part of a sovereign state, and declare it part of Russia. And now we wait to see if Mr. Trump agrees with that. have got that warm water port, which they now have, think of it from the Russian perspective if you want to understand Russia and their new nationalism. They feel hemmed in. They've got to come past Romania, which is a NATO power, and Bulgaria, NATO power, to get through the Bosphorus, controlled by Turkey, which is a NATO power, and it's only a mile wide. Under the Treaty of Montreux in the 30s, they have to ask Turkey for permission to sail military vessels through the Bosphorus. Of course, Romania says yes, but it could say no, which would be akin to an act of war. The other interesting thing about this area, and again about nationalisms, Moldova, you might have noticed, voted in last weekend a very pro-Russian president. So did Bulgaria. In Moldova we have Transnistria. They had a civil war there after the end of the Cold War. There's 2,000 Russian troops there. So what we've now got is Russia losing its buffer zone, so making sure it's got a smaller one there, Kharkov, Luhansk, Donetsk. They've got there. They did try militarily to join it up, but failed. You can't rule out another go at some point in the next couple of decades. Odessa is 50% Russian speaking. Very easy to get a rebellion going there if you want and join the whole thing up round to Moldova. And that battle is on. Diplomatically that battle is on. And as I said, the pro-Russian president has just been elected. And I've been to Moldova and they are not impressed by how friendly we've been. And obviously we haven't invited them into the EU or NATO because we're hedging our bets, the way we hedged our bets with Ukraine. Because if Ukraine had been in NATO, we would be at war now. We don't have a choice when it comes to the Baltics, and let's see if we're going to find out whether Article 5 means what it means, or whether there is some wiggle room to get out of Article 5, and there is wiggle room. The wiggle room is that large parts of the populations here are Russian. So I will go to the town that's 50% Russian on market day and throw a grenade into the market and kill lots of ethnic Russians. Then I'll do it again, then I'll attack the funerals, then I'll attack the demonstrations. And eventually I will foment real problems. And the nationalism of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania will kick in against the Russian ethnics and it will get out of hand. And at that point, little green men can start coming across on holiday from the Russian special forces. Plausible deniability. And at that point, a Russian militia could be formed and they come into these places. Plausible deniability. Have they been invaded? No. So are we going to stand and fight for them? Probably not. Or are we? We're not going to if Mr. Trump repeats the word obsolete about NATO. He said it in the campaign trail. I doubt he'll say it again. Let's find out. Again, from a Russian perspective, geography. They're trapped up here in the ice. They're not trapped, but it's hard to get out to the sea lanes. Even if you can get through the Bosphorus, come round Greece, which they're trying to pull away from NATO, certainly trying to pull Crete away from NATO, Cyprus rather. You come past Italy, where American fleet is in the Bay of Naples. You come past Spain and Portugal, NATO powers, through the Gibraltar Straits, controlled by Britain, and only at that point are you in the great sea lanes of the world. From their perspective, got to think of it from Moscow's perspective. Okay, we'll come out the Baltic, past all these NATO powers, through the Skagerrak Strait. Only then do we reach what's called the kill zone. That was the kill zone for the German subs, and in the Cold War that was the kill zone for the Russian subs coming down. This is called the GI-UK gap. Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom. That's the gaps, that's the kill zone, that's where NATO waits for the Russians. From the Russian perspective, to get to the great sea lanes of the world, where we already are, they feel trapped. And it needs to be factored into the thinking of understanding Russia and what they think is going on. I don't think we're aggressing them at all, but I understand why their population believes that we are aggressing them. And the population does believe it very, very strongly. The other thing about the, well, you know that we're leaving. The Scandinavians are also beginning to meet separately out with the EU. And that great Scandinavian bloc, that geographic bloc, is coming together, making decisions and then going to the EU and saying this is what we think. Big regional blocs are emerging based on geography. The Visegrad group, you'll be we're aware of, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia and Hungary. The Visegrad group also meets out with the EU, goes to Brussels and said, this is our view. The core countries, which bear a passing resemblance to the Holy Roman Empire, really do, which was based anyway on geography and trade routes, is merging as well. And then on the periphery, where it always was, there we are. So you can see there's a geographic split, and the pull is at the moment stronger than the push. My own view is that if the true believers go for ever closer union, they will break the union completely. Reform is probably the middle way, but that's not in their instincts. Mrs. Merkel, just last week, has already hinted she will give way to an extent on freedom of movement and of labour. If she'd have done that 6 months ago, we probably would not be leaving the European Union. But they've got quite a shock and quite a wake-up call. Yeah. That's what a lot of people thought. Obviously, a lot of people thought great, but that's the majority reaction, as is that. I don't know what French for Schadenfreude is, but I detect a little bit of Schadenfreude in the good luck. It's not good luck, it's good luck, guys. I believe that Mr. Boris is actually at the moment, forgive me for treading on policy exchange eggs, but he's Secretary of State for going around the world going, gosh. And he does it extremely well. And we need someone to go around the world and say, gosh. But the heavy lifting is being done elsewhere. And the Foreign Office is being neutered. And I find that a great shame, because it's an institution I'm very fond of. He'll come back. I simply draw your attention to the title of the newspaper. I make no comment on it. Before we voted, there was a poll. 45% of people right across the Union want their own referendum, and at that point in March, 33% would go out. And of course, in different countries, it's different places. Italy's the most interesting, and you'll know that Renzi's got a referendum coming up. If he loses it, the five-star movement will grow. Who knows what's going to happen? France, we can see there that if Mrs. Le Pen gets in and calls the referendum, that 41-55, as we learnt in our country, can be flipped. So if she wins, and at the moment the smart money, as it was on Brexit and Trump, says she won't. I thought we would leave. I predicted Brexit, but I got it wrong on. I said that Clinton would win by a narrow margin. I got it wrong. Sweden is really interesting. We do have this lovely old-fashioned idea of them as cuddly, ABBA, Volvo. They were one of the most warlike nations in Europe for many, many years, many decades, hundreds of years ago. But I've been up there a couple of times this year. There really is a real strong growing sense of nationalism. And that is because 1 in 5 Swedes now was not born in Sweden. They have had a massive influx very, very quickly. And I don't talk about the rights and wrongs. I'm just saying that I cannot think of an example in history where a society has been changed so quickly without real trouble. It's just impossible to achieve, and perhaps politicians ought to factor that in again when they factor in their policies. It's not always about doing the right thing morally, it's about doing the right thing in the long term morally. And Sweden, the extreme right wing is growing very, very fast, as it is in Germany. Germany last year, I think it had, ballpark, about 380 attacks on refugee centres. And we think we've got problems. Can you imagine if we'd had 380 attacks against refugee centres in our country? That's how bad it is in Germany, and we're not covering it properly, sadly. The genie is out of the bottle, and I'm not sure how to put it back in. Because a few years ago I'd have asked you, name me a far-right party, and probably most of us could only come up with Front National. Now these are all household names now. Swedish Democrats are going great guns. I haven't even got the 5-star in Italy there. Alternative for Germany picked up huge votes this autumn, this spring in the local elections, and they will be in the Bundestag next year. There's no question about it. They could get up to 40 seats. Similar to UKIP would be in about 40 seats, I believe, in this country if we had a different system. They will have about 40 seats. Mrs. Merkel will turn to the right next year to try and draw that sting. They have not peaked. None of them. Well, maybe Golden Dawn has peaked, but the rise of the extreme right has not peaked. Turning briefly on the geographic level to try and explain what the hell is going on in Syria. There are many, many things and many, many layers. The one that's not reported often enough, and it's only one of the layers, is geographic. And that is that the Americans delivered to the Iranians in 2003 the great Iranian dream to safeguard their western flank against the Arabs. The Persians wanted that for thousands of years, and the Americans delivered it in 2003, much to their surprise. So now what you have, Shia-dominated Iran, capital, direct link down to Baghdad, and as we know now the government is Shia-dominated. Link across to Damascus. Assad is Alawite. As you probably know, Alawites are an offshoot of Shia Islam. Comes from the old Great Silk Route. They stopped, the traders stopped off in Damascus from Persia, eventually got into the culture. Some of them stayed Shia, but a lot of them became Alawites. And the Alawites are about 10% of the country, and they rule what's left of it. And then the final bit of the jigsaw, of course, is Lebanon, the bottom half of which is Shia and Hezbollah, and the bottom half of the south of Beirut is Shia, Hezbollah. So now I've got a link from the Med to Tehran, and none of those four elements want that link cut. And everybody else does want it cut. And that's why there's not going to be peace for a very, very long time, because no one's anywhere near sorting out whether it's going to be cut or not cut, whether it's going to be federal. So I'm afraid we've got at least another 2 years, I think, of bloodshed. And that means we've got another 2 years of projecting instability that way. That also has not stopped. It's coming back. The Turkish deal probably will not hold. And the rise of nationalism is concurrent with it, sadly. Right, move from geography to identity, although they are mixed. I, again, feel that just as people overlook geography, not in this room, of course, people often overlook identity. And the sheer power of a flag. Iwo Jima, Washington, I can't think of a British equivalent to this. And it speaks volumes about how they view their flag from sea to shining sea. They salute it every morning, Pledge of Allegiance. It's a red, white and blue riot right across the country. And we don't do it. And it's another one of those examples that Churchill was right. We are a people divided by a common language. And too many Brits think that America is like Britain. And it really, really isn't. More power of the flag, that was over the Reichstag in 1945, became a stamp in Russia. Doesn't get much more iconic than that. If any of you think the moon landings were faked, and the proof is that there's no air on the moon, so how come the flag was flying? It's called an iron rod. But that little bit of evidence in our post-truth society apparently doesn't make any dent at all on the people that wear tinfoil hats. Because it was done in Nevada, allegedly. That's the great one that we all know, some of us love. 13 stripes for the 13 colonies that had the temerity, and there are some Americans in the room, have the temerity to take us on and beat us, forcing us to go back and burn the White House. And originally they were going to, and this is very similar to a Sons of Liberty flag that they fought under, and the Tea Party, there's a direct link from Sons of Liberty to the Tea Party, and some of them resurrected the old Sons of Liberty flag. Each star for each state, but originally they were going to have an extra stripe for each state. And you can see how that would go badly wrong very quickly. So they changed it under their flag law of 1805 or something. But the moment they look at it, you see the history is there of where they began, where they started fighting for democracy, these 13 mini nations that became a large nation, and the colours are for freedom. They take it more seriously than many nations. That is one of the ceremonies to get rid of a flag if it is torn or tattered. Another one, you can cut it up and bury it. And I was reminded of the ceremony that some Orthodox Jews have, that if a copy of the Torah is damaged, you don't just throw it away. You can give it a proper burial with a blessing. It is a totemic, it is a religious thing that you're dealing with. And the flag to the Americans means much more overtly, I think, than it does to us. Now, this may or may not work, but I just wanted to bring the whole thing together with how iconic their flag is to them. So, who presses play? Oh, right. How do I do that?
The next
Watch this.
Say, can you see my dawn's early light? What so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave? For the land of the free and the home of
Not bad, eh? Not bad. And he just brings it all together. The anthem, the iconography, the singing, the words in the song, and it isn't how America, I think they are more patriotic, openly patriotic. I don't really know how much we have left, because we have been taught to be so embarrassed about our patriotism over the past few decades. So I think we're unsure about how deep it still goes in this country. The flag itself. Sorry. The story of the national anthem is fascinating as well, because after we went back and burnt the White House, the British fleet was off Baltimore Fort and about to bombard it, and an American rowed out to ask him not to, and they took him on board, and he actually watched the bombardment, and as he watched the fort being bombarded, he wrote this poem, "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early line, is the flag still there? Can I see it through the rocket's red glare and the bomb burst?" And yeah, there it was, and yes, he could, and that flag is now in the Smithsonian. It's a fantastic piece of iconography, and huge flag, bigger than this room. Well worth it. Back to Scandinavia, as I said, they are coming together. They are beginning to talk about having their own trading bloc if things do go wrong. They're doing it very quietly, so as not to undermine the EU, but they do have a shared history. It is shown by the Scandinavian cross. But one of the things I found interesting, that the very part of Europe which is the least Christian, it's probably a post-Christian society now, is the one that's got the most religious symbols on it, which it is interesting. I'm not sure what it means. There's stuff in history about royal families and that, but they have kept on with the Christian iconography, and again, given the direction of travel, I think that these symbols are going to start meaning more to more people, unfortunately. There is actually a bit of Christian iconography down south. apart from the Greek flag, the only other place you'd find it is in the Portuguese flag. Those 5 shields are for the defeat of 5 Moorish kings shortly after the end of the Crusades. And the 5 dots in the shields are the 5 stigmata of Christ. So again, there's this echo back to culture, which we've almost lost, and you can make a strong argument there's parts of it we should well put behind us. But they're still there. They're still there around us. Whenever I go to a city, I always say, who's that? If it's a statue. And if it's a really well-known person, you know that everyone around you is aware of this story. And I think we are in this age of identity politics, and we are about to see a resurgence of things like history, geography, nationhood, nationalism. Well, it started. I don't think there's any denying that. My favourite flag. Any guesses?
Macedonia.
I said the vexillologists should leave. Again, nationhood. There is no such country as Macedonia. There is only the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. And it's the only one called that. I mean, Slovenia is not called the former Yugoslav Republic of Slovenia, Bosnia, etc. And that's because a large part of Greece is called Macedonia. So when Macedonia became independent, firstly they wanted to be called Macedonia, and Greece said no way, and they lent on the European Union, because this impinges on their sense of identity and their nationhood. So it has to be called the former Yugoslav Republic. And they originally came up with a different flag that was the original symbol of Alexander the Great, because Macedonians say he was Macedonian and the Greeks say he was Greek. Does it matter? It matters very, very much. Because if you accept that this symbol is of Alexander the Great, who it is arguable was Greek, and the the top half of Greece is called Macedonia, and your country is now called Macedonia, and your country has Alexander the Great as its symbol, that is the beginning of a step towards irredentist Greater Macedonia, and taking that part of Macedonia, which irredentist Macedonians believe is theirs, and that Thessalonica is the capital. So this stuff really matters, and there's no way the Greeks can give quarter on this. They have to say, no way. Again, I'm not talking about the rights and wrongs of this. It is amusing when you fly into Alexander the Great Airport in Skopje, you go past a statue in the arrivals hall of Alexander the Great, and then you go to Alexander the Great Highway into Skopje. That is a different symbol of Alexander the Great. That was the compromise that the Greeks would allow. But it's a really good example of how politics and symbols continue to matter. Arab flag of revolt, 1916. There are people that think Mark Sykes of Sykes-Picot had a hand in designing it. There is some evidence for that. Sharif Hussein of the Hashemites certainly did that. The red is for him. The green is for the Fatimid Islamic Empire. And then a white, I think, is for the Umayyads, and the black for the Third Great Dynasty. And they thought they would put these together to say this flag is for all of us, Sunni and Shia. Now it's slightly problematic because therefore it's not for the Christians of this great Arab state, but leave that to one side. And that idea and those colours spoke volumes to them. Now, we sold them out, we stitched them up, and the dream did not happen. I don't think it would have happened anyway, because, for example, a huge chunk of this greater Arab state, of which Sharif Hussein was going to be sheikh of, is now Saudi Arabia. And whether we were involved or not, Saudi Arabia, the House of Saud, would have gone to try to take that area eventually. Nevertheless, the Pan-Arabic dream is still alive. They don't share it. And this is a fascinating flag. They don't share it because they don't believe in nation states of any sort, only the caliphate. What's interesting about the ISIS flag is it's black and square. It is thought Muhammad's flag was black and square. This is the Shahada, the profession of faith for Islam. And the stamp of Muhammad is here in the same shape as you can see it in letters at the Topkapi Museum in Istanbul. But the really interesting thing about it is how ragged it is. This says 6th century. This doesn't say the nice calligraphy of the Saudi flag, who are apostates according to ISIS. This doesn't say nation state. This says going back to my roots, we're the originals. Colonialism didn't help us. The strongmen didn't help us. Dictatorship hasn't helped us. They don't believe in democracy. What's left? The authentic, original Sunni Islam. And that's what that flag says. And it has flown quite a lot. It's getting torn down now. They're going to lose. They're definitely going to lose. But the idea behind that is not losing yet. So the flag is interesting. There'll be another one along in a minute after they've gone. Also, there is, I think it's a hadith, a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, that the black flags would appear from Khorasan, which is vaguely Afghanistan area, and they would come to a place near Raqqa, Dabiq, and they did. They took these two towns and they flew that black flag and they said, "See, we are fulfilling the prophecies." And of course, if you're of that religious persuasion and you are the equivalent of a born-again Christian but with an Armalite, yes, it makes sense. And that flag flew. The black flags flew less and less. We're going to lose, as I said. There'll be AQ Mark IV after they've gone away. Briefly to China, just to get an understanding of symbolism. Obviously, they went for red for communism. The big star is the party. The 4 stars is the proletariat, the peasants, the proletariat, the bourgeoisie, and brilliantly, the patriotic capitalists. Now, how far-reaching was that in the early 1950s, that you included the patriotic capitalists, who actually now should, of course, be on the big star, but what it says completely is that party dominates. I was in Beijing last month. Everywhere you see this flag, everywhere you see massive ads on the side of buildings with the People's Army marching up and down. And they're not recruiting, they're just there for you to be constantly aware who's in charge. The big star is in charge. Don't even think about challenging it. Hong Kong is interesting. The People's Republic, the People's Army headquarters, very, very tall building. It doesn't dominate the sky. It didn't used to dominate the skyline, but last year they've been very quiet, just sat there in Hong Kong, and then last year they put a massive yellow star at the top of the building. You can see it from lots of parts of Hong Kong. And they're just saying, just remember who's in charge. It's quite a symbol. Very briefly, I'll have to get on to Africa. This is the Star of Solomon of Israel on the Ethiopian flag. Because as you know, he took a shine to the Queen of Sheba, she took a shine to him, they had a son, he was the first emperor. These colours were the colours of the Ethiopian flag in its previous incarnations. And it was the only country not to be colonised. And so when the other African countries began to get freedom, these were the colours they went for. Red, gold and green. If you like Bob Marley, you'll have heard a lot of it. Marcus Garvey said these were pan-European colours, and he added black as well, either way. But it's a strange thing that the Star of Solomon has lasted 2,500 years. That's the old Ethiopian flag, that's the Lion of Judah, obviously the most Christian nation, royals. But when the Marxists took over, they could not have religious symbols or royal symbols, so they got rid of that. But the Rastafarians still have that flag, and the Rastafarians believe that Haile Selassie is God, because if we go back to the Solomon, who is from the line of David, unless I'm mistaken, if any religious people are amongst us, yes, Solomon is of the line of David. As you all know, either the second coming or the first coming of the Messiah will be from the house of David. Haile Selassie is in a direct line from the first emperor, whose dad was Solomon, who comes from David. Therefore, it's obvious, isn't it? Haile Selassie is God. That's what they think. And to this day, they believe it. I mentioned Marcus Garvey, who lived in this city. He had the Black Star Liner company, the shipping company, to try and get black people back to Africa. He was Jamaican. He really influenced a lot of the intellectuals in the early 20th century. And so when the African countries began to get their independence, they went for these Pan-African colours, which he had prophesied. And Ghana, the very first one, took the Black Star of the Black Star Liner shipping company and put it in the middle of their flag in tribute to Garvey. Garvey, if you're driving up the A4 before you get to the Hammersmith roundabout, big row of artist studios, there's a blue plaque for him. That's where he lived. Never saw Africa, died here, taken back to Jamaica, And that is why the Jamaican flag is the colour it is. Pan-African colours, Garvey, it all comes together. And of course, many Jamaicans know that as soon as they look at it. And if you want to understand a country, understand its symbols. Just quick trot through the chapters. This is how it's broken down in the second book, in the flag book. There's a mistake there. That is not the flag of Australia. We're going to have New Zealand twice. What's it going to look like without that? I personally don't think they're going, but we can discuss that. You can see the family of colours coming out there. One of the many flags that... There's only one nation-state flag that has a modern assault rifle on it. It's Mozambique. But as you can see, some of the terror groups tend to put a lot of it on. Symbols like grenades, symbols of the geographic area of Israel with no dividing lines, saying we don't believe there will be, and this is how we will achieve that. And you can see the Hezbollah one. No, I haven't got... The Hezbollah one is actually taken from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard ones, which again shows you that connection which I talked about earlier. Lawn Tennis Association. It's actually a yurt for Kyrgyzstan. It harks back to their nomadic things and the fact they went to Glastonbury every year. Nepal. It's the only one that shape. That's both a royal symbol, but it's also the Himalayas. It's the two peaks, the two largest peaks of the Himalayas. Again, you really see the family of flags coming out there. Yeah, there's Mozambique. Next to it, Kenya with the Maasai warrior. Very briefly, these are interesting as well because the Maasai are one of the smallest groups of people in Kenya. So it's not problematic to put their almost Pan-African symbol of the shield in the centre of the flag because they're not a threat to the other groupings of people. That's problematic because that's almost exactly like the Fremlo flag, which the Russians paid Fremlo enough money to pretend they were communists, so they fought on the communist side in the Civil War and the Cold War. The problem is that Fremlo the leadership was from one of the 5 major ethnic groupings. So now the other 4 major ethnic groupings, when they look at their flag, are looking at the flag of the guys that won the Civil War. That's very problematic. And they're not knitting themselves together in the way you might want. Latin America, that's the Wapala. Andean people's flag now has parity with the Bolivian flag in Bolivia. Because Morales is from an ancient Aztec culture, and he's actually given it legal parity. And it's spreading across the Andes, and it's a very, very big debate in that part of the world. That's fun. I still think that space creatures designed the UN flag, putting us right in the crosshairs. It's a very outdated flag. 5 continents, 5 members of the P5. Who the hell are we to say to Brazil, we're vetoing you? Plucky little Britain vetoes India. It's outdated. The flag is outdated. The UN is outdated. It needs reforming. And every time I look at the flag, I'm reminded of that. And I've just left 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to give a sermon, but thank you very much. I thought it was just a fascinating talk. If you teach international relations, every summer a keen student will say to you, what book should I recommend what do you recommend I read over the summer? And I was kind of puzzled, and you kind of think, well, I don't want to give them a theory book because then they won't come back in September. And, if I give them something too kind of journalistic or too kind of simplistic, then they'll come in with all these kind of preconceived prejudices. Well, now we've got an answer because Tim's book, Prisoners of Geography, I think is a fantastic introduction, but also a kind of detailed exploration of world politics and geopolitics as well. And so I thoroughly recommend it. Buy a copy for all of your relatives at Christmas, and obviously their delight as they all open it around the tree. What do I think the book contributes? One of the things I took from it and I thought was really interesting, for me the major contribution of a book like this is that it conveys empathy. If you want to understand where the other country is coming from, where the peoples in another region are coming from, you read a book like this and you begin to get a sense of it. You get put in their position and you begin to understand how their geography has shaped their attitudes, their culture, their language, and their future foreign policies as well. So I think it's hugely important for empathy, and it's a really important virtue that we need to cultivate. The old joke about empathy and geography is that before you criticise somebody, you should always walk a mile in their shoes. That way, when you do, you're a mile away and wearing their shoes. But really, the point, actually, when you think about empathy and look at people's geography, it removes that level of distance. Despite cultural and linguistic separations, you can understand how a mountain range could represent a barrier, how unnavigable waterways might present problems for your economic development. So empathy is hugely important in the book, and I think it's very useful as well if we're thinking about, if I'm going to try and tie this to British foreign policy and our major foreign policy challenge of Brexit, empathy. Where are the European countries coming from when they're trying to negotiate from us, and what can we give them that will persuade them to give us a good deal? Usually if you end a relationship, you say, it's not you, it's me. At the moment, we're kind of saying, it's not me, it's you, and listing all their faults and explaining why we don't want to be part of their organisation anymore, when actually we could be very praiseworthy of the European Union and its achievements and simply phrase it in terms of the narrative could be that it doesn't quite suit our island story, perhaps, our particular geography and culture and history. However, we can see it works for people on the continent and we want to support you in your future aims. So you could change the narrative there if you had empathy, and Geopolitics helps us have that. It also reminds us of the path dependency, if you will, of that actually some people's choices are limited by their geography, by their cultural background and how that links with geography. So one of the questions I kind of wanted to put to Tim or just pose out there is how far can geography be overcome? The idea of prisoners of geography implies a kind of tragic vision of politics. Robert Kaplan's book Revenge of Geography kind of implies a little bit more leeway, a little bit more freedom, just saying that this is a backdrop. I think in one part in the book he talks about peoples that go with the flow of their environmental context are more likely to be successful, and those that go against it can be challenged. But there are examples in the book of countries that seem to decline and other ones that ascend, and it doesn't always fit the geographical situation they're presented with. You tell the story of Argentina. In 1900, one of the top 10 countries in the world in terms of economic development, it could have gone on an ascendant path, and instead it begins to decline. Whereas Japan, which has all sorts of geographical problems, ends up becoming the second largest economy in the world. So those kind of stories are interesting. How far can geography be overcome? Is geography what you make of it, if we adapt a phrase? The third one, and this is a little bit of pushback, but I've done the praise, so a little bit of kind of a critique, is that the stories nations tell about geography are influential, but we can challenge them. And I really think we should challenge Russia, for instance, the narrative it's putting forward about its geography and the justifications that's being put to in terms of disrupting democratic movements in its near abroad. Because in the 1990s, Russia could have pivoted to Europe and could have stayed pivoted to Europe. There were key moments when NATO offered Russia future membership of its organisation. It's only a few years ago that NATO was signing contracts so that its heavy transport aircraft were Russian. Well, if you're going to threaten Russia and invade it, how are you going to do that if you have to ring up Russia and get them to borrow their planes off them before you do that? So this story of victimhood and the repeated kind of way that is framed, particularly by a number of US writers, could be challenged. And we could say, well, actually there are political choices going on here, and that some of the geography is less salient, and you could have decided to behave towards your neighbours in a different way. Fourthly, the other point is about how world order is changing, and I think here geopolitics is becoming much more relevant, or even if it was always relevant, it's certainly becoming very salient at the moment. This notion of globalism, that our specific geography and where we're situated was going to be less relevant in the 1990s because of globalisation. There's pushback from that now. There's increasing authoritarianism. Even groups of countries that were challenging that, like BRICS, are now being seen as actually fragmenting themselves, and that idea of a transnational grouping of states resisting globalisation is breaking up. Putin's failure to meet with Brazil's President Michael Temer recently is seen by some as evidence that because Brazil's adopting a more favourable US line, that maybe the BRICS will begin to fragment as well. So are we facing a mercantilist kind of nationalist future? And if we are, and it's a more narrow view that people will take in their foreign policy, then suddenly geography obviously is going to be much more important, because if you're taking a narrow view of your interests, you're going to be looking at your immediate, near abroad, who your neighbours are, and what specific challenges you face in your region. And lastly, the importance of identity, and I think it's well brought out in the Flags book and very interesting. It's not a flip remark. I was saying earlier that it's a great book if you want to answer those two key questions you always get in pub quizzes, which is the flag that has an AK-47 on it, and which is the one that's a triangle. But also, it reminds us of the importance that people attach to these symbols and the stories that we tell about our nation and where we come from and where we're going. And this is too often ignored in British foreign policy. A number of times we've done seminars and conferences with different governmental departments, and the bit that people don't really turn up to or are not that interested in was British identity talks. And then when you did the stuff in the afternoon about other countries, that's when you got everybody coming along. And actually, that kind of narrow-mindedness has been a real problem, because it meant that people didn't anticipate Brexit, they didn't anticipate the real problems that we're facing at the moment, telling a coherent story about what kind of country Britain wants to be in the world at the moment, what our identity is, and how we're going to get the support of our people to pursue our foreign policy in the future. So there's just a few ideas sort of posited out there, and thank you very much for the talk. I think it was excellent. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions. I've just seen a gentleman come in the back of the room with a Union Jack tie, so he will definitely get the first question. After me, I'd like to open with one, and it just occurred to me when you're showing the sort of groups of flags, where you have obviously distinctive different national identities and stories in a lot of contexts, and yet sort of groupings, whether they be Islamic, Arab countries or African countries. There's a lot of red, white and blue, particularly in the West. And it was to pose to you a question, if this sort of, I think it's 25 years since Francis Fukuyama wrote his End of History. So everything you've said in both books suggests that's a misleading way of looking at things, and that history's back, geography's back, and national identity is back. And then on the flip side of Fukuyama, you of course have Samuel Huntington, who argued that we were likely to enter in the future into a phase of a clash of civilizations. So my question to you is whether you think future conflicts, struggles and strategies, particularly those involving Britain, will go on the lines of national identity, certainly that would look more likely in terms of Brexit, or national interest, or whether they will be civilizational, whether you might see a return to global scale religious conflict, perhaps even return to ethnic-based grand strategies. This is one thing people forget about Woodrow Wilson. He was very much concerned with the preservation of the white peoples 100 years ago. So maybe, do you think it will be a national-focused geopolitical scene, or a civilizationally focused geopolitical scene?
I read both Fukuyama and Huntington when I was with the Northern Alliance in northern Afghanistan, waiting to go down to Kabul. And it was pretty obvious which one of them I was going to believe. And it wasn't Fukuyama. This guy is absolutely 100% wrong. Even though there wasn't absolutely a clash of civilizations going on there, it is more multi-layered than that. But as for the future, I think there'll be a clash of civilizations insofar as culture. Yes, the democracies, the West against authoritarian. As for ethnic, I'm really hoping that we are moving beyond that, but that's about each individual country managing to build within its own geographic space a sense of identity. Mrs. Clinton said it takes a village, and I agree, but it also takes a town and a city and a nation, and part of that is to get over your embarrassment about the nation, bring everybody into it so that we don't have the ethnic divisions, because if there are going to be divisions as there are, they're growing around the world. You do not want them repeated inside your own borders. And I reluctantly say that France has got a bigger problem than we have. I mean, I wish none of this was happening, but France has got a bigger problem than we have. So it is down to all of us, but politicians, to foster that sense of nationhood. And yet that is so old-fashioned and gets you regarded as some sort of horrible national socialist or something. Whereas in fact, all it is accepting what has been true all along, and that is a sense of home and identity, has always meant a lot to people and always will. And we have to somehow foster it within our own geographic space again.
Thank you. I'll go on the basis of urgency, but I did say the gentleman with the Union Jack flag could go first. I think that's only fair.
I didn't realise it brought such advantages. Thank you. My question would be, of course, what I'm wearing is a national flag, but I'd be grateful for your views on sub-national flags. The Scottish Saltire, the Cross of St George, the flag of Prince Edward Island, the Cornish flag, the Yorkshire flag. They are, I think, quite important for a sense of identity, and an awful lot of people have, if you like, a sub-nation state identity that is very important to them, and which is not quite the same as a sort of narrow and ethnically based nationalism.
Yeah, that's also come back, I mean, particularly with the Scottish thing. I mean, I've got the word Yorkshire tattooed on my arm with a white rose underneath it, and that's because there is, when I was younger, there is a sense of identity there. That I mean, nobody in this country, I believe, has got the word Hertfordshire tattooed on their arm. They haven't, have they? Well, stand up if you've got the word Hertfordshire. You haven't. That has never gone away, that sense of it. I wrote another book a few years ago called Dirty Northern Bastards. And the back cover is called Soft Southern Bastards. And it's a story of our football chants and how we converse with each other through these cliches of the terraces. And they've never gone away either. So yeah, all the regional stuff is important, but it's not as important as the nation state. But going back to the Scottish one, sorry, I've been going around in circles here, but the Scottish flag is a national flag. And so it's not in that category of Yorkshire, Scousers, Geordies, or whatever. We have absolutely knitted a nation-state national identity for the majority of Britons, the vast majority of Britons, but it is fraying now, and it's fraying badly, and the Scottish flag is becoming more important. You can't rule out Welsh nationalism growing again, even Cornwall and Devon, but I really think all of that is manageable. I don't really see that England is about to break up. I don't see any evidence at all for it.
Okay.
It's more fun. It doesn't go as deep. You're not going to die for it.
We'll start at the back and then come forward. The gentleman there.
You mentioned the sort of snowflakey student who said he just didn't understand the relevance of flags. And I would suggest that's because the sort of neo-bourgeois left assume that flags have some sort of quasi-religious significance. They're based on historical myth, when in fact what flags really are symbols of where ultimate state power lies. And so they have a very material significance, because it's about who gets to set your taxes, who gets to determine immigration policy, and so on. And so the reason the modern centre-left don't get it is that, and because of that, you're seeing the sort of political realignment you discussed when you listed those organisations that you said were far right, and I disagree with your analysis on that. Most of those organisations are not far right. They are sort of centre-left populists who are now filling a vacuum, and as a consequence, traditional working class and patriotic voters are leaving the traditional parties of the left, who have become transnationalist, obsessed by identity politics in a different sort of way, and they're voting for centre-left populists.
Well, we agree on snowflakes. We disagree on the far right. I'm absolutely. I mean, Golden Dawn, we wouldn't argue about. Yeah, the Finn Party.
Left-wing populists.
Well, yeah, well, I'll give you the National Socialists. They'll raise you. They are all anti-immigrant, and they all have a strong racist current running through them, and a strong anti-Muslim current running through them, all of them. And I don't see them as being centre-left. I know they're populist, but I don't see them as being centre-left. And I've already forgotten a bit before. Oh yeah, where we would agree is that over the past few decades we have learned to keep stum about certain things in this country, which has been very, very harmful, keeping stum about it, making large sections of the population think that there's something wrong with them liking their country or even loving their country, and keeping very quiet about it, which is why Brexit, people didn't see it. Most people didn't see it coming. Ditto Trump. I mean, I've got a friend in where I live, and he's in his 60s, and he had a Trump baseball cap, and he brought it into the cafe the other day, and he said, he had to show it to me like that, because Le Tuchisique would have appeared with, flaming torches and nooses and attacked him. And it's that sort of reluctance that you've been shouted down. I mean, look, I know this is a policy exchange audience, so many of us are on the same page on this, but yeah, it's been so harmful to tell vast swathes of the country, you're wrong, you're old-fashioned, you're a knuckle-dragger, you're a little Englander, and it's almost forced them into areas they haven't been in for a very long time. So we agree. Mostly.
Two in that. I'd maybe take those two together for the sake of geography.
With the sort of sea lanes north of Russia starting to open up a bit and ice receding over the next sort of 5 to 10 decades, do you think that will change the situation in Russia pushing west and south?
Yeah, gentleman beside you. Does it follow nicely? Okay, we'll have that question answered first. Yeah.
Sorry, repeat the question. It was sea lanes.
With the temperatures rising and the northwest and northeast passages starting to open up a bit more, I think the last 2 or 3 years they have been navigable. Over the sort of following decades, do you think that'll have a vast impact on Russia's sort of expansionism towards the west and south?
I don't suppose it depends whether you think it's expansionist. I think it'll be exploitative of the resources. I think your book sets that out very well, actually, in terms of, if it's an opportunity there, they'll take it. But I think an awful lot of this rhetoric is inwardly directed. It's about shoring up their own support at home rather than necessarily kind of trying to achieve things abroad as such. So I think it'll be limited. I don't see Russia as a particularly expansionist power.
Russia had a competition a few years ago to rename the Arctic Ocean, and the winner was the one that said it should be called the Russian Ocean. They're getting brigades, they're moving a lot of snow-trained fighters brigades into the Murmansk region. It was Clinton that said, we've got villages on the Arctic and they've got cities on the Arctic. There's no question who's going to win this race. Russia's going to win the race. Russia will get most of the stuff out of the sea. They've got 34 icebreakers. The Americans have got 2, one of which doesn't work. And they are more interested in it. So at the moment there's the Arctic Council and there's a forum, and I think nobody wants to fight over that area. I don't really think, to get to the point of your question, I don't think it will alter the geography of the North European plain and then telling their population you are threatened. Yes, it slightly makes things easier for trade and getting it, but I don't think it gets them out into the great sea lanes of the world like that. So I know where you're coming from. It is something that is important that's going to happen over the next few decades, but I don't think it's a game changer for Russia's behaviour.
You just reminded me of your chapter about them planting their flags on the North Pole.
Yeah, they took a sub down and they put a titanium flag on the floor of the Arctic.
I was going to ask you about what you think is going to happen in Spain. You've got certain parts of Spain that have a sort of a strong identity with themselves and not the rest of Spain. What are your thoughts for the future?
Well, again, at the moment, the centre is holding, the ring is holding. If I can go back to Scotland, it's one of the reasons I don't think Scotland will get independence, because I don't think they would vote for it, because everybody would remind them towards the end of the vote that Spain will never allow Scotland into the EU, because if Spain allows Scotland into the European Union, what argument does Spain have about Catalonia and the Basque Country? It has no, it's just cut the legs off its own argument. that is not going away, but at the moment it's manageable. I mean, I know they're in the midst of it, I know at the moment, Catalonia especially. The Basque thing's gone slightly quieter. I don't see them leaving Spain in the next decade, but these are newish times. And nobody's mentioned Trump yet. Wow.
I did a couple of sort of speaking engagements in China and Spain during the Scottish referendum, and all people wanted to talk about in China and Spain, Bilbao, was the Scottish referendum, which I hadn't really thought about as being a big deal, because I just assumed that it would pass and they would not vote to secede. But it shows you again, it's like we're as guilty as anyone of not taking the identity questions at home seriously enough when other people are taking them seriously. Spain's taking it seriously, China's taking it seriously. Watching how you run these referendums and then kind of...
And Putin has opened an office of Sputnik in Edinburgh. Why would he do that? Because he can read that we are breaking apart better than we can. That's why Sputnik, the news agency, is in Edinburgh.
Yeah. So we're going to swing left, again geographically, rather than politically necessarily. There's a gentleman there with a light blue shirt, yeah.
You were saying how geopolitics can be a motivating factor around British foreign policy, and we could argue that because we're on the edge of Europe, we have a different history, that's one reason to position us or to justify our arguments towards the European Union. But how does that leave a country like Ireland?
Stranded.
Yes. Yeah, it's a big problem for them, isn't it? I mean, they can appreciate huge economic potential consequences from Brexit. But again, there's different stories you can tell about our geography. You know, heavy British involvement, financial involvement in the continent in the 18th century, funding Frederick the Great's wars and countering Napoleon, and so it's kind of, you know, you can tell a story of isolation if you want, but actually if you go back into history, even if our footprint in terms of actual troops in the continent for centuries was quite small, our financial engagement was huge. And so if we're thinking about a post-Brexit future, you know, it would fit with our history if we gave money to support European security, if we supported Mediterranean naval patrols, if we still have an engagement in European regional affairs, even if we're separate from those sovereignty kind of demanding issues.
In the unlikely event that Liz and Donald get on really well, so well, sorry, the Queen to you, so well, that we're invited into NAFTA too, because NAFTA may well be renegotiated. I mean, this is just a scenario to allow me to say, in that event, Ireland then looks, which is between us and America, and then you've got the EU. I mean, those are difficult decisions for Ireland. This is a newish time. I'm not sure, we don't yet know just how new. We've got to wait for what Trump does. If he demolishes NATO, the whole post-Second World War order is realigned. If he goes away from his allies in the Pacific, the whole Second World War post-order is being realigned. But we don't know what he's going to do, so we really are in that waiting period.
Two down the same row, just for the ease.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So I was wondering about, obviously one of the countries where this whole geopolitic thing is most present in the political discourse is Russia. Obviously you have this kind of, this going back to Mackenzie's heartland theory, you have this kind of, Alexander Dugin and his Eurasianist ideology, and I was wondering, to what degree do you actually believe that, to what degree do you think that the Russian political elite, let's say, apart from maybe more extreme kind of outlets like, extreme people like Dugin himself, to what degree do they actually feel threatened by that? To what degree do they feel that this is a viable kind of ideology, and to what degree they just use it to whip up nationalism and support and get their approval ratings up, get the polls up?
I'm glad you mentioned Dugin. Dugin is a fascinating character, a sort of like almost a Rasputin type character, intellectual, rabid nationalist in Russia that every now and again gets into the outer circle of the Kremlin. And you're right, it happens at times when Putin wants to whip up nationalism to deflect from the problems at home. But he is a rabid nationalist. I think Putin buys his idea of greater Russia, of Slavic power, of the near abroad you have to dominate. I think absolutely Putin, and I think the higher echelons all buy into that. Putin, I also believes that the Russian Orthodox Church is the successor to Rome, I think he thinks that really quite passionately. One of his confidants, he has his own confessor, one of his confidants is the patriarch, and he believes in the great Slavic dream. Dugin's idea also fits in nicely with the European, the Eurasian Economic Area, which Moldova is now thinking of joining. Now, I know it's a bit of a joke. Kazakhstan, Belarus, parts of Ukraine now, Russia, maybe Moldova, and one or two other places. You know, as an set up in opposition to the EU, it's a joke, but it's growing potentially, and it's growing because of nationalism and a different idea, completely different idea of culture and the great Slavic civilizations, and that's where Dugin fits into Putin. And I think that the Russian hierarchy does believe in that.
But I don't think
Sadly.
they probably don't. I mean, I wouldn't have said. I don't think for a minute they really genuinely believe that they're threatened by any of the European powers at present, in military sense. They might be threatened on a value basis. Their position might be threatened by democratic ideas. But it's really an emotional thing. My sense of it is Russia wants to be seen as a great power. It felt it was humiliated in the 1990s, and therefore it's asserting itself when it gets the opportunity to demonstrate its strength, rather than in a rational way thinking we have to dominate this landmass because we're about to be invaded by a potential, substantial army or something like that. It's more that it's a part of what it is to be a great power, to dominate your region.
Just to say, it was ever thus. I was reading about British foreign policy in the 1820s today. Exactly the same debates going on about the same regions of the world. Yeah, so gentleman here, I'm going to come back over there.
You spoke about international order based on existing alliances in the post-war world, but I was wondering if you could speak about the foundations of world order from a geographic perspective. So basically, based on the geopolitical and technological and economic realities of today, which theories do you think are most useful to explain the underpinnings and the foundations of world order today? Is it something closer to the Heartland theory, something closer to the Grimland theory?
I've never actually believed in the Heartland theory because he who dominates, the Heartland is the Eurasian landmass, he who dominates the Heartland dominates the world. I think that's such a big statement, it's impossible to prove. I'll leave that to one side. I'm afraid I don't have an easy answer because I think there's about 17 answers to the question. There's the cultural affinities that keep us together. There are the geographic affinities that keep us together. The EU, in whatever form, will continue to trade with itself. America is big enough to trade with itself. I think it's the most self-sufficient country, not just in terms of oil and gas, but in terms of everything that it makes, including its food. I don't see any getting away from the Chinese region, the American region, and the European region. That's not going to change. And even if globalization stalls in some areas, it will keep going in other areas, which is technology. Because the superhighways, be they digital or physical, are not going away. And the belt that the Chinese have built through the old Silk Road down to Gwadar port in Pakistan is not going away. The very first Chinese goods this week went out of Gwadar. Gwadar is a deep water port in Pakistan that the Chinese have built. It means they don't have to go around the Malacca Straits anymore. And that sort of technology, which bends the bars of the prison, I do accept that the prison of geography can be bent by a cruise missile or a bomber that doesn't have to land, or by a deep water port. Technology does bend the bars. So I haven't really answered your question, I'm sorry, because the question is narrow, but the answers are so broad, because there's so many answers to that question, that there are many things, different strands, some of which will continue, some of which will stop. TTP, probably going to stop. TTIP, probably going to stop. The EU-Canadian deal might go through. The EU-Ecuador deal will go through. We are in a state of flux. It's a great time, it's fascinating. It's time to make predictions.
Time to write important books about these questions. The gentleman here.
In the last 50 years I've been involved in maritime trade internationally, and also very heavily involved with the military as I am today on the whole, with views of foreign policy. What I'm very interested in what you're saying just now is on the Putin front, you can almost go back to the Crimea. That's what he feels like. The great in history, the great powers have always had their positions of influence. We have been very conscious of our position of influence for hundreds of years.
Spheres of influence, yeah.
Spheres,
Yeah.
exactly. What I'm going to ask you is this. People make a distinction today between patriotism, that's all right, but nationalism is not. Now you've got your flags. I wanted to bring up with you that all the militaries of the world are very, very, very proud of their flags. And the colours are absolutely key. So when you have this distinction, and in Russia, I spend a lot of time, the Russian is very proud indeed of being Russian. People must not underestimate the pleasure they have of being Russian. What I was going to ask you, therefore, taking the whole subject of the flag, where do you separate between patriotism and what the flag plays its part in creating extreme nationalism?
A sense of superiority. The moment you've got that, you've morphed into patriotism. Into nationalism. I mean, if somebody likes their village and they get best village roses of the year in the English garden, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're down the pub and sticking it to the guy next to you because his village didn't win, you've gone across that line. Forgive me for being such a sort of rather silly analogy, but I actually think a lot of silly analogies work. I mean, one of the reasons I worked out how the world works is that I knew as a kid that on a council estate, if you've got like a family with 5 brothers, and they're all tough guys, you know who runs the estate. You just have to take that template and stick it on international relations, and you won't go far wrong. Especially in Iraq with the Takrid family, we understand, but I digress. Like I said, when it tips over into nationalism is when you get the sense of superiority. There's nothing wrong with liking yourself, being proud of yourself, liking your culture, your cuisine, but if you start to think it is superior to that one, then you've gone too far.
Okay. We have time for one more question, unfortunately, and let's have a lady in interest. Is it there? Hillary, did you have a question? There you go. Yeah.
Thank you. From your presentation, particularly I'm thinking of the Crimea example, it appears as though if one looks at geography, if one looks at the map, there's quite an almost inevitability to some of the events that are happening, and we're discussing them in the terms of looking back and feeling empathy for decisions that were taken. But I'm wondering if you could give some insight on why you think they're not used more in terms of strategic foresight exercises to kind of use more of a predictive capacity by foreign policymakers than is actually the case.
I wish they did. It baffles me why they don't. The military know far more about this stuff. The MOD knows more about it than the Foreign Office. Because the MOD knows that an army marches on its stomach and it needs to get from A to B to C, and if you haven't got B, you won't get from A to C. You know, they know all that stuff because it's logistics. I don't know why it's not. But I remember being in the Foreign Office during the sort of event during the Ukraine crisis, and I remember saying, if you pull Ukraine into our sphere of influence, they will move for Sevastopol. There is no question. And so I'm left after the event wondering, did they know, and was that the price worth paying? Because we have flipped Ukraine into our sphere of influence, and the price is a small war and the loss of Crimea back to Russia. It was Russian originally. Or did they not know? I don't know which is worse. Can I very briefly finish? Yeah, the Russian flag is pan-Slavic colours. That red, white and blue, you see it as a family of flags, Slovenia, Serbia, etc., etc. And you said about 5 other things also I was going to pick up on, but I've forgotten all of them. Besides, James, I dominated.
No, that's all.
Any final thoughts? No. Okay. I will just thank you for all your questions. I know there's a lot of hands up. That means you have to buy the book if you're energetic enough. I'm going to buy one for my father-in-law at Christmas. I would just add one.
Get on.
No, okay. I just have one provocative statement that perhaps there's a difference between flags that people are regard worth dying for, or at least worth suffering for, to go back to the title of your talk, and would suggest that maybe a distinguishing difference between Irish nationalism is that the Irish people more broadly, and I'm from Northern Ireland, so I'm not saying this in a necessarily sympathetic fashion, but the Irish people were prepared to suffer lower living standards at the very least for the purpose of their nationality and their national flag. I'm not so sure that's the case in Scotland. And that might be the fundamental difference. So I'll probably get beaten up on the way. But I'll end on that bombshell. And I'd just like to thank Tim and Jamie for an absolutely fantastic discussion.
Thank you.